on the channel today, and I know you're here to find out about that F250 suspension, but I couldn't get started without showing you a really cool Corvette-powered C10. That C10 sure is an awesome truck, and if you want to see more on it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because there's going to be an entire episode featuring solely that vehicle. It's about to go into paint. We're going to do a full-on faux patina job on it, and I think you're going to be really pleased with the way that comes out. But let's talk about suspension. Originally, the 1965 F250 four-wheel drive, it got a transplant from a 1979 F250. So what they did was they took this straight axle leaf spring frame and they put it underneath the 65. Well, when they did that, they used pieces from the 1965, the 1979, and also pieces from 1977, which I found out as I was learning what was here so that I could transplant it into a modern suspension. The main hurdle with this frame, this 1979 frame, was that it had been bastardized with pieces from multiple trucks. In order to replace pieces, the first thing you have to do is identify what you have. That way I could know what I could keep and what I couldn't keep. Turns out I couldn't keep any of the suspension components except the steering, the drag link, and the steering knuckles that were attached to the axles. And obviously I upgraded the shocks. I also scraped and painted and sanded and used a grinder on nearly every inch of this frame and all of the surrounding components. The pile of parts that remained afterwards looked more like pieces to a machine cart rather than parts to a truck. This stuff was literally broken everywhere, seized, some of it was welded together. It needed to go. When this truck was a complete vehicle, the most driving that I had ever done in it was move it around in the yard from this point to that point, whatever, make space so I could get it in and crack it open. Now I know this thing did not have a good ride quality about it, and the reason I know that is the way the leaf springs were attached to the frame, when they were mixing all these trucks together, they did not assemble the leaf spring suspension the way you should. What that means is leaf springs have to have one fixed point and also a shackle on the other end to allow for a pivot so that it's a soft, compliant ride rather than the machine cart or freight train assembly that they had. For example, this was mounted to the frame. This is called a hanger. It was hanging, which is normal, and then the front would generally be a shackle so that it could pivot. Actually, this was flipped around, but for illustrative purposes, you get my drift. This then was another hanger that they took from something else and welded a plate into it, which honestly looks like a piece of the leaf spring that they just cut off. And they had a bolt underneath it. And the bolt was supposedly the motion, the movement. All it did was kind of just ride super stiff with no compliant motion at all. Also, these were 2.5-inch leaf springs, where now I have 3-inch all the way around. And the rears were no different. They were assembled the same way. So this thing absolutely had to ride like A, number one, a death trap, 2, like a brick. After hours of researching, looking at suspension parts, obviously I wanted to keep Ford with Ford. I looked at multiple straight axle 4-leaf spring setup vehicles, and there are all kinds of options. You can go with the articulation of, say, an off-road Jeep and, super high lift, and there's just a myriad of options. I knew what I needed to do was to keep the wheels in the same exact place, but I knew that I could move the apparatus that holds and allows for movement of the leaf. What I was hoping to achieve by going with a 3-inch wide leaf spring was the ability to buy a shackle set and hanger that would adapt to the outside edge of this frame. I found that in the 2004 Ford F350 Super Duty. That truck has a massive towing capacity, and while this one will not have the same as that, because of the motor and transmission selection, but it will have the ability to load it with approximately 7,000 pounds. Well, I say that, but you know, these springs are rated at 3,400 each stack. The fronts are 2,100 pounds each stack. But you'll never get to that. It's just nice to know that those are their limits. When I switched to the Super Duty suspension, it changed a few things. Number one, the Super Duty suspension bolts, similarly to the old stuff, bolts to the outside of the rear of the frame. When you had 2.5-inch springs, everything rode in just a little bit further. So when I mounted the new stuff, the axle has spring perches, these little welded platforms, if you will, that everything sits on. Well, those were no longer in the right place. They were like this. So I had the lift blocks were kind of askew. In order to make that work, I had to change the spring perches on the axle itself. What that means is I had to set the axle, I rolled it off to the side, and you can see from these pictures here that I rolled it off to the side, I leveled it up, I left it in perfect position, I ground off the old ones, and then I set, measured, and leveled the new ones. And I welded those to the axle housing. It came out really well, and when I rolled it back under, I was able to stack these things right where they're supposed to go. And it's just like they say, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Well, how did I know that you got to move those? Well, first of all, I've been fabricating things since I was in the 4th grade. We used to use plastic, and I would build all sorts of contraptions and crazy things. So I learned a bit about it, and I knew that everything has to be in the right spot. So an interesting story about spring perches. I had a 1978 Ford Bronco with a lift kit. And it had a 351, some headers, 1-foot piece of pipe, and a cherry bomb, so the thing sounded like a giant pile of garbage dragster. But it was lifted with, you know, bad rattle can spray paint job. I'm sitting at a light, and to impress my friends, I slid it into neutral, and I was going to do a neutral drop, because the thing would smoke a tire on occasion. So I revved it up, wah, 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 slam, put it in drive. The truck went pow, and it jumped and literally broke the drive shaft off and went beating around the underneath of the truck. And I crawled under there, bungee corded it up, put it in 4-wheel drive, and drove it out of the intersection so as not to get into trouble. And when I looked at it, what it did was not only break the U-joint, but it took the whole axle on the spring perches and it rotated them by bending the old original spring perches. So that was my first experience with Ford and spring perches. What I did back then, I did it in a gravel driveway, and I did it myself, but I put in these same style spring perches. They're large, they're wide, they prevent spring wrap-up, they prevent pinion drop or lift. They're fantastic. So the setup we have on here now should have no trouble pulling down a house. Well, I think it looks great up here. It's going to come down several inches once I load it up. We'll probably go up a size in tire. And the cab isn't really set, it's just resting on there. Now it's sitting on its mount, so I'm going to remove this whole floor and firewall and gain as much cab space as I can get. Woohoo! I like it, I think it's cool. The fenders, once you put the fenders on, there's going to be quite a gap between there, but we can go up one size, keep these rims, go up one or two in the tire, and I think it'll be great. And also it's going to come down once we load it up, but the next part is going to be getting as much of this cab floor removed as I can and framing in something that works. But with the cab on the frame, I'm then going to take apart the floor of the cab. I'm going to remove it, giving the driver more footwell space, more headroom, overall more comfort. And you can only go down so far because you got these frame rails there. But the reality is, if you can get down between the section, then it's really going to make a difference in the way it feels while you're driving down the road. Most people would see a pile of old junk. That's what I see too. Actually, that engine, this axle once narrowed. This pedal start assembly, I gotta figure out how that works. I have no idea, I've never worked on one of these. But I need this quiet golf cart gas engine to power a tiny single-seater Hot Wheels car. I know, it's crazy, right? I gotta figure it all out. I'm not even sure where to start, to be honest. This goes forward, neutral, and reverse, so that's a big bonus. Gas tank, I may or may not use that, but supposedly the engine ran. So I'm going to put it back in here, connect it up, and see if I can get it to fire. And if I can do that, then it'll be easier to transfer all of this mechanical stuff into this other, much smaller, narrower package. Alright, I've disconnected everything from this engine except the engine itself. The starter will spin the pulley that will rotate the engine that should create spark, and I've added fuel via gravity as opposed to a pump, and I plugged the vacuum source for the vacuum pump. I'm not sure if I needed to do that, but I did it, and in which case rev out though. There it is. I mean, oh, I bet because there you go. Yeah, it's the air. It's okay though. Yeah, we're good.